Good afternoon, everybody. We have a couple of participants joining. I can see the numbers climbing. My name is Josh Ogada, and I would like to take the opportunity to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar organized by the Africa Let's Partnership. It's entitled Powering Jobs 2019, the Energy Access Workforce. As we get more and more participants, I'd like to welcome you all, those of you who are just joining. I will run through a couple of introductions, after which we will go over a couple of housekeeping issues, and then we'll launch straight into the presentation. First and foremost, we will be having a presentation from our speaker for today, who I'll be introducing shortly. The presentation will probably last about 30 minutes, and we will have about 20 minutes at the end for a question and answer session. Today's webinar should be running for 1 hour, so we are starting at 2 o'clock South African time, 3 o'clock East African time. And for the Q&A session, we will ask participants, this is something that we frequently have to remind all of us, that for any questions that you would like to pose, you can put them in at any time during the presentation. They will be addressed at the end by our presenter. We will ask that you please put those in the Q&A panel. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A box. We would request that everybody puts their questions in there rather than in the chat area. If you'd like to use the chat area, that should be exclusively for asking logistical questions of the organizers and the rest, but please do not put your questions for the presenters there. At this time, I would like to do a quick introduction before we begin. Our speaker for this afternoon is Dr. Rebekah Shirley. Dr. Rebekah Shirley was named Africa Utility Week's 2018 Outstanding Young Leader in Energy. She is the Chief Research Officer at Power for All, where she works to improve access to high quality data and insights for the energy sector. Her work explores models for integrated energy planning and opportunities for catalyzing decentralized energy markets in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. Rebekah earned her PhD from the Energy and Resources Group at the University of California, Berkeley, where she also obtained her MSc in Civil Engineering. She has over 11 years of experience in research, analysis, and knowledge management. She is a University of California Chancellor's Fellow and has won grants from institutions such as the Department of Energy, the Mott Foundation, and the Rainforest Foundation. She currently resides in Nairobi, Kenya, and I think because of that, I can say Karibu Sana, Rebekah, where she's a visiting research fellow at Strathmore University. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Rebekah, for a presentation.
Fantastic. Thanks, Josh, and thank you to your team for organizing this webinar and this opportunity for us to just share some really interesting findings on research that we've recently conducted as the Power for All team. Let me start with just a bit of an apology. I am getting over a cold right now, so if my voice gets a little bit difficult to understand, apologies for that, and do just let me know. I'm happy to repeat anything. Let me just say a quick word about Power for All for those who might not be familiar, and then I'll jump straight into the content of today's webinar, which is all about jobs. So Power for All is an advocacy and education-based organization. We operate out of San Francisco in the US in terms of headquarters, but we're really a nonprofit that focuses on delivering clean, reliable, and affordable power to all, as the title says. We focus on countries with low energy access, like most of those in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where the challenge is really about serving the rural and peri-urban communities. And our goal is to encourage integration of both centralized and decentralized technologies as part of the pathway towards achieving that universal energy access. So we help unify that beyond the grid set of companies that are oftentimes called off-grid or decentralized renewable energy companies. We help to catalyze markets for distributed energy technology by mobilizing stakeholder groups like governments and financiers and private sector organizations. And then thirdly, we help to support awareness raising and evidence building by producing research and data that is 100% open access help people, whether they're policymakers or journalists, understand the impacts of energy access, but also the practical solutions for that delivery. And so that's where we come to today is, this awareness raising angle. And we've just recently conducted an exercise specifically around understanding jobs and the jobs impact. Let me just say before I move on that we do work specifically in Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, and India. And in the past, we've also worked in Sierra Leone and Zimbabwe and Ethiopia. All right, so let me see if I can get these slides to press. Great, there we go. Okay, so what we're gonna do today is take you through a very brief motivation of the Powering Jobs campaign, explain the campaign from a sort of high level what it's about, talk specifically about the research scope and our research highlights, and then I'm going to try to leave about half of the session for Q&A. I've also got my team on the line, my research manager, Ava Lee, who supported heavily on this research is on the line. So I may ask her to unmute once we get to the Q&A stage, and I'll do that introduction later on. Okay, so let's get into it. What was the motivation for the Powering Jobs campaign? We think that the future of work is really a major challenge for Sub-Saharan Africa for a number of different reasons. Let me get into that here. Agriculture is one of the largest employers of the continent, but is majorly affected by climate change and automation. And as jobs are growing more scarce, we're seeing Sub-Saharan Africa experience a major youth explosion at the same time. So we have these two statistics, right? That 65% of the labor force is employed through agriculture, yet that is on decline given the challenges of climate change. At the same time, we now have a situation where 1 in every 3 persons on the continent is between the ages of 15 to 24. So we have this, these two things happening simultaneously, where we have a decline in some of these more traditional sectors for jobs and a new need for jobs to support all of these young persons and their families. Simultaneously, we have another challenge, or another major policy priority rather, which is power, clean and affordable energy for everyone. Today, there are still 650 million people in Sub-Saharan Africa with no access at all. And governments and private sectors are tackling this challenge. And largely, new decentralized technologies are at the center of that. 80% of those unelectrified are rural. So we're seeing a move towards these more agile, nimble solutions as parts of the solution sets, as I was mentioning earlier, towards achieving universal energy access. I'm going to come back in a second to what I mean specifically by those types of technologies. So we're in a situation where, in fact, the rural agricultural communities that we were talking about earlier might be best poised to benefit from energy access, which unlocks all sorts of productivity. And we're going to come to seeing what type of productivity is really being unlocked in a second. So the point I'm driving at here is that really these two pillars of energy access and jobs are really tied at the hip. And so we can see sort of this, SDG 7, the energy access space, and SDG 8, decent work, really coming together. And actually, we think that there are solutions to solve both of these SDG challenges simultaneously. The challenge is, however, that even though the sector, the decentralized renewable energy sector is very young, there is a lack of data to support informed interventions around the sector. And so we felt that it was really important to do this study. So what we did with this study, and rather not just a study, but this campaign is 3 things. We decided to build an entire campaign around the idea of powering jobs to grow awareness, to produce advocacy, and to create activation or to stimulate activation. So what we wanted to do first and foremost is understand what does the data say about the relationship that exists between energy access and jobs. As I was mentioning earlier, there is often a lack of data to inform interventions, and that is most certainly the case with decentralized renewables. Again, because of this sort of the youngness or the nascency of the sector, but also it's a challenge that's more perpetual across the continent. Access to data for anyone on the line that does work in the energy space, health space, education space, water and sanitation space, you're constantly coming up against the challenge of data. So we wanted first and foremost to develop an understanding of what the existing data shows and produce data that helps to understand and highlight the relationship between energy access and jobs or employment. Based on that platform, we would then grow support within targeted institutions for creating finance, policy, and programmatic support for the sector. And then thirdly, what we would love to do with this campaign is demonstrate the new opportunities that exist for young men and women to connect all of these dots from skills to potential opportunities for employment in the DRE sector. So before we get into the results of the survey, let me say a little bit about the advocacy space and the partners of the community of action that we were able to create. Essentially, we were able to create a multi-stakeholder community that was very supportive of the campaign, that includes a global steering committee, as you see here on the left, with representatives from gender and youth organizations, energy agencies, research institutes, trade associations, as you can see, development banks and technology catalysts. And then we also have a steering committee for each country, as you can see on the right, India, Kenya, Nigeria, and I'm gonna explain why those 3 countries in just a second. And really what we've done with the support of these global steering committees, these national steering committees, and our funding partners, Schneider Electric and the Rockefeller Foundation, is we created an entire community of action around this idea of powering jobs, and the voice that we were, basically the research that we've been able to produce and the findings were really echoed through this, this group of organizations that are all implicitly involved in either the energy space or the employment space. That's been really fantastic as a sort of echo chamber for the results themselves. So what we did is we decided to, after doing an extensive literature review and finding very little by way of quantitative data on energy access and jobs, we launched a survey in 2018 to directly understand the jobs creation directly from the sector. We engaged in data collection across all of Q4 2018. We launched preliminary data collection, I'd say, and designing the survey, etc. We launched the campaign at IREC, at the IREC conference on October 31st, 2018. There was lots of senior executive participation from IRENA, Schneider Electric, Salco, Skills Council for Green Jobs. That was a really fantastic launch, gave us a great platform. And we did a lot of data collection over the course of Q1 and Q2 2019, our data analysis, and then we did our, we convened our global and country steering committees. We drafted the report, circulated for peer review, and then launched the report in Q3 2019. So some of you might have actually been at our events, which we held simultaneously across India, Kenya, and Nigeria. We're now in Q4 of 2019, and we've begun already our launch for the next year of the survey. What we're hoping to do is turn this into an annual survey, sort of like the solar census in the US, which has become the sort of, authoritative survey or census that happens every year to provide information on the solar sector. We'd love to see our little survey of just 3 countries grow to 10 and potentially 25 and potentially be continental for sub-Saharan Africa and happen on a yearly basis, so that we're really tracking really good, objective and authoritative data on jobs. So now let's get into the meat of the matter, our research scope. I was mentioning earlier what we meant, this idea of decentralized renewable energy technologies, and here's a bit about the scope that we covered in the survey. We wanted to make sure that we were exploring from the smaller pico-solar appliances, so less than 10 watts, all the way through to the solo home systems. Those are 10 watt and above, and solo home systems being not just for lighting, but also for televisions, radio, etc. We looked at productive use appliances, in particular solar water pumping, as one of the most commercial productive use appliances out there. We looked at CNI, commercial industrial standalone systems, so standalone solar systems, and we also looked at mini grids. So we really try to capture the entire gamut of decentralized renewable energy technologies. The goal of the survey is to understand what are the types of jobs that are being created by these technologies, on what scale, and what are the skills gaps. So those are the big picture questions that we were trying to tackle. When we talk about jobs, though, we have to be a bit more specific. So here on the bottom half of the screen, you can see what our jobs scope looks like. We tackled direct jobs. Those are jobs produced directly through working with some of these companies, as I mentioned, the ones on the top, both formally and informally. So formally through direct contractual relationships and informally through non-contractual relationships. We also try to understand productive use jobs. So those are jobs stimulated through the access to energy through these types of technologies, again, both formally and informally. We collected data here from focus groups and literature. And then indirect jobs are those that are upstream of the sector. So in manufacturing, in importing and distribution. We tried our best to tackle those, but from literature where possible. And what's not included at all in the survey scope are induced jobs, or those jobs that are induced through the trickle-down effect of spending in an economy. So there's not enough macroeconomic data for us to explore this right now in the countries of focus, but we are hoping in the next future iterations of the study to take a harder look at induced jobs. So really the major focus is on direct jobs and productive use jobs. We speak to indirect jobs from the literature where possible and don't, at this point, include induced jobs. One more slide to help set up before I get into the findings. Our sample, basically what happened is we have country partners, as I was mentioning in some of the earlier slides, that helped us implement across each country. They helped us conduct both phone and online survey and ensure that we had a representative sample. So in each country, we had a different number of respondents. For Kenya and Nigeria, we had over 50 respondents, and for India, about 38. For Kenya and Nigeria, this meant a statistically significant sample relative to the size of the sector, or the estimated size of the sector, and not so for India. So for next year, we are definitely hoping that we can increase the respondents rate in India. As a very critical market to the decentralized renewable energy sector, it's important to make sure that we have statistically relevant findings there. We had representation across 5 key groups, and let me just explain what those were in the sector. End user product providers are those that sell Pico solar appliances and the related products. Product developers and installers are those who, as the name implies, develop and install mini-grid projects. Their revenue normally comes from development and implementation rather than from the sale of electricity itself. Mini-grid operators are those that operate and maintain mini-grid systems, and so they are the ones that are characterized by sales of electricity as core parts of the business model. That distinction is important because for product developers and installers, because you're less involved in customer development and customer relations, you obviously are employing a different workforce profile. And we'll come to that in a second. Fourthly, we had manufacturers and upstream supply chain companies, those whose main business is in manufacturing, assembly, imports, and wholesale. And then finally, we also heard from sector service providers, those that work upstream of the sector or to serve the sector through services like microfinancing, metering, and software services. So these are the key types of companies that we're going to be talking about when we refer to the sector as we move forward through this presentation. In terms of the outputs, what we did was we were able to estimate current employment through the sector as FTE, or full-time equivalency. We were also able to estimate informal jobs and productive use jobs, as mentioned before. And then based on best available market forecasts and projected or planned government interventions and strategies, we were able to project out into the future a few years to understand what the implication might be of sectoral growth. Beyond the aggregate estimates, we are also able to understand workforce trends. So we asked in our survey a number of questions about gender, youth participation, job function breakdown, recruitment challenges, wages and compensation, and level of engagement. So we have not just an understanding of the number and type of jobs, but we have a bit more nuanced understanding of the workforce itself. And then thirdly, out of all of this, based on the focus groups discussions that we had in each country, we also have key recommendations for the sector for local capacity building, gender inclusion, and youth employment. So without further ado, let me get into some results. I mentioned that we took a hard look at 3 countries in particular, India, Kenya, and Nigeria. These were important starting points for us because they represent, for the decentralized renewable energy space, 3 different stages and scales of market growth. India being a very mature market, and Nigeria being the sort of the newest or most nascent decentralized renewable energy market. And then likewise, from a scale point of view, India being on a much larger scale than both Kenya and Nigeria. So those are the 3 countries you're going to hear me referencing over and over. And when I talk in aggregate, I'm talking across those 3 countries. So before getting into slides, let me high level for you some of our key findings. We found that across all 3 countries, the DRE sector is definitely a jobs engine. In 2017 to 2018, the sector provided over 95,000 direct formal jobs in India, 10,000 in Kenya, and 4,000 in Nigeria. This can be compared to the on-grid solar sector in India, which employed 92,000, and it can also be compared to KPLC, the local utility here in Kenya, which employed 11,000, and the national electricity, gas, and steam sector employed 10,000 in Nigeria. So we're already seeing on the same order of magnitude in terms of number of direct formal jobs. That said, we're seeing a 2 to 5 times wider impact in the informal sector and the productive use space. I'm going to explain in a second where that data comes from, but suffice to say that the productive use space is actually majorly where the jobs impacts could be, with major implications for policy intervention. We found that sales and distribution make up a majority of the workforce, especially because solar home systems and productive use appliances are the jobs engine of the sector right now. But what we found is that moving forward, because so many countries have very aggressive mini-grid policies or targets, this may change in the future. And we might see more mini-grid job group. We might see more attention towards mini-grid jobs in the very near-term future. Fourthly, we found that there is a major skills gap in the management and business administration space. These jobs make up less than 20% of the workforce, but actually are reported as one of the most difficult groups of talent to recruit for. And so represents a major skills gap. And then finally, what we also found was that women's participation in the sector is low. Roughly 23% of jobs in the sector are taken up by women, though there is acknowledged and reported understanding of the role of women in the sector. So there's real opportunity for that to be a much larger figure. Youth participation, on the contrary, is high. And those that are less than 24 made up over 40% of the sector, which is, again, there's major policy implications that we'll come to. So these are some of our key findings. I'm going to run through the slides briefly and then talk through the policy implications as we see them based on our expert opinion, based on the expert opinion that was solicited through our focus groups, and then I'll pause for the Q&A. So as mentioned, we found that job estimates for 2017-2018 showed that the sectors across India, Kenya, and Nigeria were producing as many jobs as their respective traditional utility scale sectors. And as you can see from the darker blue productive use jobs, these are orders of magnitude larger than those produced directly through employment with the sector itself. In terms of productive use, we found a lot of different types of productivity ongoing, from irrigation to milling, grinding, drying, cooling, processing. So there's a lot happening in the productive use space. And what we also found was that businesses themselves, so decentralized renewable energy companies, are they don't have strong metrics or standards in place, rather, for measuring and understanding productive use jobs. This is one of the major areas where we think there could be some work in the future, is standardizing the way that we do monitoring and evaluation around productive use, so that we have better and better figures in the future. In terms of projections for 22 to 2023, we found, as mentioned, that this direct formal jobs footprint might grow it might double in India. It might also double in Kenya, but could be almost as much as tenfold in Nigeria, just because of how quickly the sector is growing there. That said, informal jobs look to be remaining constant in India, doubling in Kenya and more than doubling in Nigeria. Again, this might be due to the impact of the mini-grid sector, which employs a number of jobs through informal labor. In terms of engagement and retention, we found that the sector is producing highly skilled full-time and long-term jobs. Skilled jobs are those defined by the ILO as having or involving leadership, management, professional, technical, or associate professional skills. And so we found that across all three countries, those types of jobs, i.e. skilled jobs, make up more than 50% of the sector, actually more than 60% of the sector across all three countries. This is in comparison to the 50% for the 50% of skilled jobs for the broader renewable energy sector across all three countries. In terms of level of engagement, we found that most jobs offered by the sector are, in terms of direct formal employment, are full-time. Again, that's higher than the renewable energy sector, or the broader renewable energy sector, I should say. And then we also found that average retention is quite high, over 30 months for those full-time jobs across all three countries. In terms of women's and youth participation, we found that women account for less than 30% of the direct formal jobs. This is compared to 32% for the global or broader renewable energy sector. And this is despite, as I mentioned earlier, despite expressed value and understanding of value of women in the supply chain. Just as an example, many companies report in their surveys understanding that women are key for encouraging entrepreneurship. This is really important for the mini-grid space, and they're also important for distribution of product. This is important for the solar home system space. That said, there's many challenges to recruiting women, and we're going to come to those in a second. So although the women's participation rate is low, this might be what we consider a repressed rate, and it could be much, much higher. That said, women constitute a very high percentage of the informal workforce across all three countries, as much as 60% of the informal workforce in India. Again, showing the potential for women's increased participation in the workforce. And youth participation across the workforce is high. Companies expressed strong interest in hiring young people and the benefits thereof. But again, there are some major challenges to recruitment, which we'll come to in a second. So in terms of job function breakdown, how do these jobs look spread across the sector? We found that the types of skills being recruited in each country and sector are different. So for instance, in India and Kenya, more than 2/3 of the workforce is engaged in sales and distribution, as these countries have more mature pico solar appliance and solar home system markets. But on the other hand, in Nigeria, we found that the workforce only has 8% of its direct formal employees dedicated to sales and distribution, likely due to the nascency of that sector in Nigeria. But on the contrary, more employees are found in the commercial and industrial, or more jobs are coming from the commercial and industrial space, which is much larger in Nigeria, leading to more employees in the operations and maintenance space. You can see across all three countries that that's playing out. In Nigeria, we have more, Nigeria on the bottom bar, you're seeing more jobs across management and business administration, as well as product development and installation, as I just mentioned, like gray bar. And in Kenya and India, you're seeing that sort of grayish blue bar, much larger for sales and distribution. And this is likely to change over the course of the next couple of years, given the growth of the mini-grid sector across sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm going to come to a slide on that in a second. But this is just to give you a sense of how jobs are spread across the sector. And as you can see, because of this broad spread, that also means that we're looking at not just jobs in the STEM fields, as in terms of science, technology, and engineering, but really across management, legal, business development, and sales as well. Now, for each country, as I mentioned earlier on, we asked survey respondents questions about engagement, job function, gender, skill, age breakdown. And so for each workforce, for each company type, we actually have an entire workforce profile that we now understand. These can be found, I'm just going to go through one example here, Kenya, but these can be found in our country reports, and I'll show you where to find those in a second. But suffice to say, for every type of company, so from the end user product providers through the mini grids and through to the what was I saying? Commercial and industrial type companies, as well as the manufacturing companies, we have a really good sense of what this workforce profile breakdown looks like. So just here, we can see an example from the end user product providers. As you can see in Kenya, they have a predominance of full-time jobs. They have predominantly sales and distribution. Of course, these are the solo home system type companies. We also see that there is a major skew towards men in this space, and towards skilled labor, and towards youth. So there are some very positive profile characteristics, but also some that, you know, we want to take a harder look at. Here's an example for the product developers and installers. As you can see, it changes a bit in terms of the job functions and engagement, but also majorly changes in terms of gender. In fact, we found that mini-grids companies and product development companies were on the lower end of the spectrum in terms of hiring women. And then here you can see that again for the mini-grid companies. So what might this mean as we look forward to 2022, 2023? What we're seeing in India is that skills needs might shift slightly away from sales and distribution into project development, installation, O&M type jobs, again, because of the aggressive mini-grid strategies or plans, targets, so that's the word I was looking for. But in Kenya, sales and distribution might remain the most important skill in demand, given the continued growth that is expected for the solar home system space. And in Nigeria, we found that project development and installation skills will continue to remain in high demand, while the importance of O&M grows, again, because in Nigeria, there is a very aggressive mini-grid target. So to reiterate some of these key findings, we're seeing that the sector is nascent, but is already producing as many jobs as the traditional utility scale sector. That most of these jobs are really looking to be coming from the productive use space, especially as we look forward into the future. That solar and solar home system companies are currently the jobs engine, although this is likely to change in the near term. That the sector produces high-skilled jobs with relatively high engagement and retention. And then finally, that women and youth, which are generally the hardest impacted by the dearth of employment opportunities, particularly in rural communities, have different levels of participation. Women's participation being low currently, while youth participation is quite high. So what does this mean from a point of view of future policy interventions? I'll speak to this just a bit and then close for Q&A. What we're seeing is that there's clearly need to unlock the DRE sector's potential to scale and create more employment opportunities. And this means that there's a major opportunity for collaboration between government, academia, training organizations, and industry associations. In particular, as I mentioned before, we found that managerial skills are in high demand, being identified as the most difficult to recruit. And so that really means that there's an opportunity for us to think about the way that we create industry engagement opportunities for these fields of study. So there's a major opportunity for training and academic and training institutions to rethink the curricula of our STEM fields, but also of our business management fields, and then to think about industry exposure opportunities through the implementation of those curricula. Alongside technical skills, dairy companies reported that general business soft skills were critically lacking, affecting every aspect of company performance. So here we're not just talking about business management skills, we're talking about general soft business skills, including leadership, strategic planning, communications, understanding how to manage projects, compliance, anti-harassment, personal health and safety. These are skills that are really they're cross-cutting, so they cross business functions, and companies are saying that they really affect business performance and are generally lacking across the board. Again, this represents another opportunity for government, academia, training institutions, and industry associations to intervene and create opportunities and modules for general business soft skills development for existing staff, and also to ensure that these are skills that are included in curricula for students. Thirdly, we found that there's a clear opportunity for further youth engagement. Companies highlighted the benefits of working with youth, but also highlighted that some of the challenges stem from the lack of awareness of opportunities that are offered by the sector. Again, given the sector's nascency itself, many graduates are unaware of the opportunities that are available and don't have opportunities for engaging with the sector. Another challenge was the lack of youth experience and the lack of established pipelines for youth recruitment. So that meaning for companies, it's difficult to identify where to interact with graduates and how to interact with them. And for universities, there aren't established channels for engaging industry. So this is a major, again, coming back to sort of the first point, a major area for potential intervention. Fourthly, we found that there's much greater need for participation of women in the sector. Encouraging women's participation is important, not just for gender equity, but also as unemployment rates tend to be higher among women, and especially rural women. And so leveraging the opportunities that decentralized renewable energy technologies offer in rural communities is critical. At the same time, though, women are beneficial to the sector itself in particular areas of the value chain, as I mentioned earlier, giving that example of entrepreneurship in the mini-grid space and product distribution for the solar home sector space. So there really is an opportunity here for encouraging greater participation of women. Part of the challenge that companies identified was, again, challenges around recruitment, poor representation of women in STEM fields, and then also traditional stereotypes, both in the business space and in the household around the role of women. And we can talk about those and unpack those more in the Q&A. And then finally, let me say that the sector's massive footprint in the informal and productive youth space really cannot be understated. It represents an opportunity to encourage direct training interventions to support more, formalization of labor, but also to support more entrepreneurship in the space. And ensuring that labor in the informal and productive youth spaces is aligned with local and international decent work standards, compensation standards, and social protection standards is therefore critical and, again, cannot be underscored. So essentially, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we launched our report in July of this year. That's the report cover on the left hand. We launched that alongside 3 country reports, which go into a deeper and nuanced understanding of our findings for each particular country. So that's the example of Kenya in the middle. And then we also produced a fact sheet. For those who really don't have time to dig through a 40-page report or even a 10-page report, for you, we have a 2-pager, a fact sheet that highlights all of the key findings. These can all be found if you go to our campaign page. That's the hyperlink at below. After the launch of the report and its accompanying content pieces, we received widespread attention. We had major international media outlets reporting on this work, from Forbes to Quartz, Reuters, BBC Africa, CNBC Africa, World Bank's energy blog, the World Economic Forum. So we got a lot of attention for this research, and I think that underpins the importance of the findings and the important linkage between energy, agriculture, and jobs, as we started off from the very beginning. We also got a lot of local attention in national daily papers in Nigeria, Senegal, Malawi, Rwanda, Uganda, Ethiopia, Nepal, and India, just to name a few. So there was really both attention at the global level and at the national level, underscoring the importance of this kind of work and underscoring, I think, the importance of making sure that we continue this work into the future, so that we have not just a year's worth of data. For jobs, it's really important to understand historical and longitudinal data. And so I think for us, it's really important to carry this work out into the future. Let me pause there and just say that by going to the report itself, you can find far more detail than how we've gone through in the webinar today. You can also find our limitations. You can find our plans for future work. And in terms of future work, we were part of a founding member of the Sustainable Energy and Jobs platform that's currently being coordinated by IRENA and the ILO, and we hope to do continued work on the job census through this platform, and we are indeed looking for partnership in those efforts. So let me just pause there. Thank you for taking the time to listen as I rapid fired through those findings. But let's take a moment now. I'm going to pass it back over to Josh to just unpack some of your questions and answers. And as I said, a host of material can be found on the website and through the content that we produce.
Thank you so much, Rebekah. And once again, a warm welcome to those of you who may have joined midway. I hope you were able to at least catch most of that very interesting presentation. Rebekah, there are a couple of questions that have come in that I'm going to go through at the moment from now. The first one was about relevant statistics on Ethiopia, and if you have any of those. I know you did mention in your presentation that you have country reports, but I'm not sure if that covers anything beyond Kenya, Nigeria, and India. So do you have any relevant statistics on Ethiopia?
Easy answer for that one, no. We really wanted to make sure that we focused in on country-specific data. As you know, each economy is very different, and jobs, employment, workforces look very, very different country to country. So it's hard for us to take data from these three countries and map them over to any other country. It's very specific to these three, but as I mentioned, we are hoping to, we've already launched, in fact, the survey for next year, and hope to include more countries in the future.
Great. The next question asks, in terms of projections, how do you see technology affecting the type of jobs that will be in demand in the DRE space? And do you have examples of jobs that will emerge due to the tech growth?
That's a great question. I think what we saw is that because of the major focus on mini-grids and productivity, so mini-grids and productive use across these three countries in particular, we really did see in the future that there is going to be this sort of, explosion of jobs in the operations maintenance space. But then again, because of the sort of the opportunity for solar home systems, that's not a saturated market yet, according to what we're finding. And so there's more and more remote communities that solar home system technologies are penetrating. And so we're also still seeing a lot of growth in the solar homes in the sales and distribution space. So those are going to, I think, continue to be the kinds of jobs that are predominant in the DRE sector, given where the sector is going to grow in the next couple of years.
Great. Another question is, what policy interventions can be used to catalyze these jobs in Nigeria and Kenya? And what policy options have been used in India to create jobs alongside energy access?
That's a great question. It relates to the slide before last that I showed. I don't know if I'm still in control of these. Let me see if I can go back to this one. Yeah, so in our three countries, what we did is we launched the report simultaneously on the same day in July by holding roundtable discussions, specifically to explore policy interventions at the local level for each of these countries to leverage these findings. And what we found was that there's what we found is that the participants at these roundtables, so these were very high level government, ministerial stakeholders, as well as private sector stakeholders and those from academia. And we found that the policy interventions that were being proposed are very much aligned with and validate those that you're seeing here on this slide in terms of the need for firming up and establishing recruitment pipelines, the need for supporting the space through direct training interventions. So this is outside of the degreed university higher education. We're talking about direct trainings for companies themselves in terms of business soft skills, and also direct trainings for communities in terms of developing that entrepreneurial workplace that's going to leverage productive use. So those were some of the key things that we found, and those were the key things that were discussed in all of these conversations. So I really do think that there's some very targeted and practical policy interventions that could be used to catalyze job growth.
Thanks. And linked to that, the next question asks about, raises the issue of the lack of affordable training and even mentorship, and what would possible recommendations be from your side to remedy this issue as it's being raised?
Yes, this was an important point that came up, was the affordability of trainings and also the availability of trainings, especially in rural communities. There's very few TVET spaces, technical vocational educational training, i.e. TVET, spaces that offer relevant trainings, especially for the new technologies that are coming on board and that you need to be able to use to leverage all of this productivity that comes from energy access. And so I think the availability of training is critical, and especially here in Kenya, where we've had this evolution, and there's now, counties are able to implement policy that be enacted sort of more quickly because of the sort of the devolved nature of policy development. I think this is a real major opportunity for making sure that we have broad, widespread trainings that are affordable and available across the country.
Great. And I think another question that is linked to that is, are there any plans by the government of Kenya and Nigeria to transition some of the job projections from the informal to the formal sector?
That is a fantastic question. I think it speaks to issues around work standards, compensation standards, protection standards, and there aren't any plans that we know of to transition, but this was one of the recommendations from us, was to ensure that there are standards for the sector around informal employment. I think that's a great point, but I don't have a good answer for that. I'm not sure if at the time of writing there weren't any plans, and I don't think that there are now, but it's an important point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. There's a comment that's come in, so it's more of a comment than a question. The comment says, what will be a major boost to women and youth participation and create power jobs for them is to develop products based on clean energy, just like ARED is doing in Rwanda, that this will also help increase productivity. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I think that comment underscores what we found to be true, which is that women in rural communities tend to be the hardest hit, as I mentioned before, by this decline in jobs that are available through traditional agricultural spaces. And so I completely agree that encouraging productivity, small scale rural agricultural productivity is critical for not just economic growth, but really it will have a targeted impact on women and rural women in particular.
Great, thank you. Another question that's come in is, let me find it. We typically see DRE companies hire staff after successful fundraising rounds. Given the fact that such companies are still growing, thus are still not profitable, would you say that investor support to these companies would remain key going forward in order to enhance job growth?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And that's, for us, underscores the reason to ensure that we have long-term or longitudinal data to explore, because workforce profiles and trends change year on year. As companies grow, sometimes it doesn't mean an expansion of a workforce. It could mean the contraction of a workforce because of economies of scale. So it's really important for us to keep collecting data. And I think that investor support will remain key to enhancing job growth. But I really want to just take this opportunity to underscore the importance of needing better data to understand what those trends might actually look like in the future.
Thank you. And we've got the final question that we have so far is whether the raw data from the survey will be is already publicly available, and if it isn't, will it be publicly available?
Of course, we can't share raw data from a privacy protection point of view, but all of the data collected in aggregate is available if you just take a look at this report here on the left-hand side, the full energy access report. You'll find in our appendix all of the data that was collected in aggregate through the survey.
Okay, thank you very much. It seems like we don't have any more questions at this time. We'd really like to thank you, Rebekah, once again for taking the time out to present this webinar. And of course, a big thank you to the participants as well for attending, but also the great questions that you've asked. Just a quick reminder that the webinar will be available shortly. We will send out notifications to all the people who registered when the webinar is available for you to, including the slides, in order for you to download and to view, and also possibly to share with those who were not able to attend today. Just a quick note in terms of wrap up. This webinar was organized by the Africa-Leds Partnership. I see that there are a lot of our members who are attending today, but for those of you who may not be members of the Africa-Leds Partnership, the partnership brings together representatives from governments, civil society, and private sector working to advance low emission development strategies across the continent. We work under the umbrella of the LEDS Global Partnership, and we work alongside other regional platforms from Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. The objectives of the Africa-LEDS Partnership are to promote information exchange and coordination among LEDS programs and country institutions that are undertaking and supporting LEDS on the continent. Secondly, we aim to cultivate and support LEDS champions across Africa. And thirdly, we enhance the capacity for the design and implementation of LEDS in Africa. Our work tends to revolve around the two communities of practice, which we run quite actively, the FOLU community of practice, which is the agriculture, forestry, and other land use, and the Africa Mini-Grids community of practice. Both of these communities of practice are active networks of practitioners who work together on real-time policy, technical, and market solutions related to low emissions development. A community of practice approach was favored over conventional knowledge sharing networks that tend to engage in top-down development assistance. So for those of you who, a lot of you might already be members of our community of practice, but if you want any more information on our communities of practice or the Africa-Leds Partnership, we invite you to take a look at our website, theafricaledspartnership.org. At this point, we would like to thank all of you for attending. And if there are any any questions after the end of the webinar, we ask you to feel free to send us an email, which we will then send through to Dr. Shirley, and hopefully we can get answers for that. But at this point, we would like to thank you all for attending and bring this webinar to an end.